Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to week 6 of our Tectonics lecture series. Both this week and next week's lectures will focus on tectonic and geologic processes associated with subduction zones. In this first mini lecture, I just want to remind you all of some of the reasons subduction zones are of such prime interest in tectonics and why they're extremely well studied by earth scientists worldwide. So here's a map of the global distribution of subduction zones presently. You already likely know that these are concentrated primarily around the Pacific in what is known as the Ring of Fire. But there are also, of course, subduction zones representing the closing of the Tethys and Neo-Tethys Sea that define the Alpine Himalayan subduction and continental collision zones closer to us here in Switzerland. And subduction zones are at their most fundamental level important because they represent the downwelling branches of Earth's convecting mantle. I've shown this movie of a subduction model attempting to mimic the Earth's mantle before, and it highlights again how cold lithosphere appears to form at the Earth's surface and eventually starts to sink. That forms subducting slabs, and these slabs are continuously generated and continuously consumed back into the mantle, sometimes getting stuck at higher levels of the mantle, but other times penetrating all the way down to the core mantle boundary. And they govern the patterns of flow in the mantle both at small scales, forming these very local convection cells, and at larger scales where they actually guide whole mantle convection. They also interact with and deflect upwelling sourced from mantle plumes that are developing at the core mantle boundary. And mid-ocean ridge-like upwellings are also produced in this model, but overall the speed of the plate-like lithosphere at the surface and the vigor of convection is governed more heavily by the downwelling features, which would represent the subducting plates. Subduction zones are also critical because the process of subduction is what has led to the formation of continents over time. And it's also the one process that is capable of destroying continental material by returning it into the Earth's deep interior. The subduction-related processes that lead to the growth of continents include both the accretion of material in an accretionary prism, as well as magmatic underplating through melting of the slab and intruding that melting material upward into the overriding plate as plutonic rocks. At the same time, however, certain processes associated with subduction zones can also destroy continental material. This includes the subduction of sediments, especially where the sediments are derived from a continental overriding plate. And so if, for example, rather than accreting onto the accretionary prism, these sediments are subducted into the deep mantle, that will represent a net continental loss. A related phenomenon that we'll talk about more later, but that is also common in some subduction zones, is tectonic erosion. This process occurs in subduction zones that are converging very quickly, and these zones do not develop accretionary prisms at all. Instead, the overriding forearc material can actually be entrained by the subducting slab and pulled down with the subducting slab, again representing a net loss of continental material. Some of you may have heard subduction zones referred to before as a subduction factory, especially by petrologists and geochemists. And it generally makes sense to call it that if you consider firstly that subduction delivers volatiles to Earth's interior through the conveyor belt-like feeding of sediments and altered oceanic crusts that are volatile rich to the trench. Those volatile-rich materials are then sampled and modified somewhat during slab melting and associated arc magnetism, and some of them are even output back into the atmosphere at that stage via volcanic arc degassing. But ultimately, some fraction of the input volatile budget is likely delivered eventually to the mantle, so is lost to Earth's surface. And you can imagine that understanding the volatile budget of this subduction factory is really essential to understanding the coevolution of different sectors of our planet, the lithosphere, the mantle, the hydrosphere, and oceans, and the atmosphere. And just as examples of two of the most essential subduction factory volatiles, you can probably guess that they are water and carbon. The diagram on the left is one example of an attempted volatile mass balance where the authors tried to estimate the water budgets of various processes from the input of water and sediments and oceanic crust and serpentinized mantle on the seafloor to melting of the slab and deserpentinization and ultimately to deep recycling to the Earth's interior. And you can see that the estimate of water that actually reaches the deep mantle is really quite uncertain, from about 0.2 to 2.4 kilograms, which equates to a range in percent of about 3 to 70%. So this is certainly something we need much better constraints on, and is an avenue of very active research. Then the diagram on the right is just showing the various sources of carbon in the subduction factory, and you can see it's fairly similarly distributed within that system as water, but it exhibits different behaviors in how it can be entrained in arc magmas, the types of minerals it partitions into, its role in serpentinization processes, its ability to be stored in the upper plate, etc. Subduction zones are also, of course, important because of their potential for seismic hazard, which I'm sure you all are already aware of. But just to remind you of the fact that subduction environments produce the most abundant, the largest, and the deepest earthquakes on the planet. This diagram shows recorded global earthquakes above magnitude 5.5, with the symbol size representing magnitude and the color representing depth. And we'll talk later about why subduction zones host such large magnitude earthquakes. And just as a spoiler alert, it's primarily because they're cold and they're moderately to shallowly dipping rather than steep tectonic features. And notice that they exhibit earthquakes down to 700 kilometers depth. These are earthquakes that develop within the slabs themselves rather than along the interface between the slab and the overriding plate. Those earthquakes are what define the slabs and make up what's called the double Benioff zone within the slabs, which we'll talk about later as well. And of course, relatedly, subduction zones also host the majority of Earth's active volcanoes, hence the term for the Pacific, the Ring of Fire. And as you may recall from previous classes, the volcanoes associated with volcanic arcs are volatile rich and silicic, and so are quite explosive. So not only are subduction zones hosting a lot of them, but they're more hazardous to life and property than many other volcanoes forming in other plate boundaries. So I hope that gives you some quick reasons why subduction zones are fascinating tectonic features and gets you excited to learn more about them in this and next week's lecture segments. So here's an overview of where we'll go from here. Our next mini lecture focuses on the factors that influence subduction plate speeds. Then we'll talk about subduction zone physiography and geometry and the factors that control this. We'll discuss subduction zone thermal structure and how that leads to different degrees of metamorphism within different subduction zones. We'll talk about rocks and deformation that define the subduction plate boundary. And lastly, we'll talk about subduction zone seismicity. Note again that these mini lectures will be split up over 2 weeks, hence why there's so much content listed here. Okay, thanks for your attention.